Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is lecture 3, and I want to start by asking a question about our topic this evening, which is the validation of egoism inductively. Does egoism need a validation? I've often been asked, isn't it enough just to prove that altruism is wrong? So I want to get rid of that question in advance by saying that polemics, refutation of an opponent, is never the way of validating a positive principle. Never. Philosophy in this regard is not like mathematics. In philosophy, reductio ad absurdum is not a method of proof. You can't argue, as you could in mathematics, for instance, either X or Y is true. There's no other alternatives in a given case. Y is demonstrably absurd, therefore X is true. That is not an acceptable method of philosophic argument. Apart from all other reasons, and even if X and Y are the only two possibilities, a philosophic validation has to provide you with an understanding of the principle involved. How it derives from the facts of reality, from what facts, along what range of data, presupposing what context, if any, and how the principle integrates with the rest of the truths that you accept. The sheer fact that the opposite of an idea is ridiculous leaves all of this information completely blank. Now, of course, it will be necessary at the appropriate point, as it always is in induction, to contrast our principle with an opposite principle, because you can't clearly understand an idea without some knowledge of what is the alternative to it. Could you put that all the way on? Thank you. That is what's known as the genus method, or what we've been calling the genus method. But the model to use here is what we used last time. We contrasted our principle, reason is man's means of survival, with the method that animals survive by percepts. But that did not mean a whole song and dance denouncing percepts as evil or inadequate. And the same thing is true here. We make a positive case for egoism, including as part of it a relatively brief contrast, so we know what the principle is stating as against what, just to make it stand out sharply. And the contrast, as last time with animals, so this time with the opposite of egoism, will guide us in our positive inductions, help us to know what to look for. Now, we've got to start by understanding what we want to validate. We know that as adults, and that's fine to use in what we're doing tonight, we know that self-sustaining activities are automatically built into living organisms, into the lower animals, plants, into the bodily processes of humans, into the early, more perceptual level behavior of children. By the way, all of this knowledge would be established by biological observations and induction. But a child or an animal is not an egoist. Egoism is a matter of choice, not of whatever is automatic. It does not apply, the term does not apply to animals or to children before the age of abstract thought. I'll give you a definition in a minute, but it's the deliberate fundamental choice of a certain principle defining the beneficiary of your action. The question is, when you reach sufficient maturity to conceptualize this issue, you have to decide, in effect, your attitude to the biological data that's been true up to now, whether to adopt and continue the preconceptual rule of your behavior as your conscious motivation or not to do so. That's the issue here. So there's no use saying the validation is all animals are this way and all children are this way, etc. That's pre-ethical and pre-choice. Now, I'm talking about choice. So as I said last time, obviously we are presupposing that we have the power of choice, of free will, and that we know that we do. You can't induce egoism or any normative principle, which is broader even than an ethical principle, if you don't have choice and know that you have. There's no such thing as grasping. You should, this is proper, this is what you ought to do, this is what is right, etc. So we're presupposing free will, which is the precondition of all philosophic principles except essentially except metaphysical, as philosophy is man's proper relation to existence, and therefore we're taking for granted free will this evening, and the validation and discovery of that is for another course, or if you feel very venturesome, in the question period. Now let's start in the standard method of reduction, and I go to an ordinary dictionary, and this has the following definition. Each person, this is the definition of egoism, each person should hold, and then they give you a whole bunch of choices, his own welfare, his own well-being, his own good, his own personal interests, and there's still more, but that's enough, as the supreme end of his actions. So I'm going to use those all interchangeably for a while because the dictionary does too. Each person should hold his own welfare or well-being or good or personal interest as the supreme end of his actions. Now observe that this is defined strictly as an issue of what we call the beneficiary. Who should profit from or gain from the actions? And it says each person should be the supreme end of his own actions. But there's a tremendous amount that is omitted in this statement. It doesn't, for instance, give you any definition of welfare or good or what's to your interest. Zero. It gives you no clue as to who should decide those questions. That doesn't say anything about the person acting makes the choice. No, it doesn't say anything about who chooses or who values the values involved. It doesn't give you any idea how, by what means you achieve your welfare or your interests. It simply says whatever your interests are, whatever self-interest is, however the values defining it are chosen, by whatever means it's achieved, none of which we know, go out and get it for yourself. So, as stated, this is an empty formulation. It offers no guidance to behavior, and it is most definitely not self-evident. There's nothing in the world to justify this on its face. It certainly needs a validation. Before we leave this definition, I want to call your attention to the fact that even in a dictionary, some of the standard confusions are clarified. It says that you should hold your own welfare as a supreme end. And that clearly is different from the only end. In other words, supreme end means the only ultimate end. So when we get to the question, well, when you love others, is that egoistic or not? There is nothing in this definition that says you can't love others. What it says is that if you love them, they must redound to your own welfare ultimately. Your welfare is a supreme end, but perhaps essential to that is the welfare of somebody else as a means. So don't ignore the word supreme, and you won't be tempted into such an idea as if you love others, that's altruistic. Now let's start reducing. Now, to those of you who took this course before, I didn't use reduction last time. I used intuition, which is not an acceptable method. So now I'm departing pretty radically from last time's class. I'll end up again pretty much at the same place, but not the same way, because I'm doing it more systematically and trying to be conscious of method. Well, the first thing you would have to grasp such a concept as holding your own self-interest or your own welfare or your own good as supreme, you'd have to have a concept of what is a person's welfare. What is the good? You can't say, my view is that X should be the supreme end, if I don't have any idea what X is. So before you can reach such a concept as the egoism, as the beneficiary of this good, you have to know, what is it? What is it good for? Or put it in another way, good by what standard? What are we going to call the good? And how do we arrive at that, which we have to in some terms before we can get to, and now the proper attitude is to get that for yourself. Now, I am not saying you have to be a philosopher. You're at the early elementary stage of induction here. It is not necessary to know or to discover some unique common denominator uniting all values and constituting the standard by which they're defined. You obviously don't have to know life is the ultimate standard of the good. If you had to know that, the question would be, how in hell would you get to know it? We're at the point here where we don't know anything yet. So you couldn't require that. So we're not looking for some one concept which will give us the definition. That would be impossible to demand at the beginning of ethics. But we are looking at this stage for, or when we do this reduction, for some kind of common denominator beyond merely a hash of unrelated concretes. There would be no meaning to the idea of my welfare or my well-being or my good if I held on a par all the following things are good or important: getting a raise, seeing a movie, finding a decent dentist, having a good session of lovemaking, smoking a great cigar, etc. If I had 50 of those and that was it, I couldn't go anywhere in ethics with that. Because how would I decide what constitutes my welfare? And therefore, how would I ever reach such a question as my welfare, or the welfare of me is the supreme end? I mean, is 2 cigars going to be equal to a good dentist, or what? There would be no way whatever to have any standard by which to know what you were trying to achieve. You need some unified view of the end, the top value. Some kind of common denominator running through the things you are valuing, by reference to which you say, this is what tells you what welfare or well-being or my interests consist of. This is the abstract standard. Now, as I say, it does not have to be a philosophically precise and unique formulation. It has to be more than a hash of concretes. So the first type of induction, or rather one type of induction, is indicated to us right here. We would have to observe values in some abstract terms beyond just going to a good dentist and finding a new toothpaste, etc. And we would have to try to find some kind of common denominator, something that united the various values that we pursued, and then put them all together and say that common denominator defines well-being. And it would have to make a list of the values that are most prominent at this point in our lives, and then try to abstract what is common to them that would be the thread defining welfare. Now, right away, the question is going to be, well, do we just look at anybody pursuing anything and say, well, that's a candidate? There's all kinds of values and goals that people pursue, many contradictory, many conflicting. If we have to just start by making a list of all the values that everybody pursues in order to reach the idea of welfare, it's going to be chaos. That certainly is a true observation if you thought of it. So we obviously can't just take any candidate of value at random. We have to delimit what we will allow as a value for this particular induction. Now you're going to ask me, but how do we know how to delimit? How do we know what things to count as values and which not? Because we're at the very beginning of ethics here. Good question, which I'm going to answer. That's all I want to say in advance, because right now we're just structuring the induction. We're not doing it. All right, point 2 now. That's the highest stage of our reduction. The first stage back down. Let's go now down one step more. Before we can come up with a set of values and then look for their common denominator, which is what we were doing just now, and thereby define well-being, we first must have the concept of a value, a single value. And here I'm going to just take Ayn Rand's definition because I think it's uncontroversial and simple. The object of an action, that which one acts to gain and keep. Now, how would you get this? We have to reach this concept of a value by observation and abstraction, by generalization from what we observe. So we would have to observe many individual goals that we regarded them as desirable, and then abstract from them A, B, C, D, E, F, the common denominator, that each represents something I want and try to get. And then we're going to call that value. And then once we have the idea of value, we go on to define a lot of individual values, and then later we ask, and is there a common denominator, and we get to self-interest. Now, what does value contrast with in this context? That which one acts to gain and keep. Now, I think the most important contrast that is required for a person to reach the idea of value initially is the need of action as against passivity. Value is that which one acts to gain and keep. You can't reach the concept of value, therefore, as long as you are on the level of simply mooning, wishing, yearning for something with no idea of doing anything to get it. If your state in regard to every goal is the equivalent of, oh, I wish I was an A student, but you never lift a finger, or I wish I was a novelist, or I wish Prince Charming would, come into my apartment, or I want to relieve human suffering, but practically speaking, all I do is watch TV and walk by accident victims who are bleeding in front of me. Those are not values. To reach the idea of value, you have to observe yourself and people acting to gain something. And you will see that there are many different goals that people are after, involving many different forms of knowledge, many different opportunities. What's common is people who take action as a means of attaining something. They act to gain and keep something, or they act to avoid and destroy something, which is the negative, the disvalue, as against indifference, no action. Simply they shrug with or without the veneer of empty wishing. And that's what's required to gain the concept of value. So, to recapitulate our first two stages, to get the idea of self-interest as supreme, you have to have the idea of self-interest. To get self-interest, that is a set of values defining self-interest, you have to get the idea of a value. Now, how do you get the idea of a value? What does this depend on? And that brings me to the third stage, where we're coming straight down now to the directly perceivable. You can think of it as the mind side of the mind body. Before you can grasp the need to act to achieve something, before you can experience the need to act for something, you must grasp the idea of choosing something as your goal, of selecting it, of saying, in effect, out of all the possibilities, I pick this as the object I commit to. And then, of course, it follows inevitably that if that's what you choose, that that's what the thing you want to get, the expression of that is you act to gain and keep it, and then you have the concept value, and you work up from there. In other words, you have to evaluate by choice, and in some terms know that fact before you can get to the idea of that which I act to gain and keep, and thus value. If you don't start with the idea, start with I choose X, then you have no sense of yourself as a valuer. And that means you don't have any sense of anything as of value to you. In other words, if you simply, for instance, go to school as sheer routine, because your mother expects you to, and that's what everybody else does, and you've never had any question about it, and you've never thought about it in any way, you've never made an affirmation, you just are a zombie, you could say, in a sense, yeah, this is a value to the person. They get out of bed and they act to pursue something. But that is not a value of a kind that would lead them anywhere in ethics. It wouldn't lead them up the ladder from value, from choice to value to standard to self-interest as supreme. Contrast that, on the other hand, with I can go or not, and I have to decide whether I'm going to school. Why would I go to school? What reasons do I have? What is my purpose? I want to get so-and-so and so-and-so, and I want to achieve this and that, and this is a necessity, and this is the price, and I'm willing to pay it. I choose this. And at that point, this person has chosen a value and has become a valuer. And at that point, when he goes to school, he's functioning as someone who acts to gain and keep something, not someone who is merely mimicking goal-directed action in a Peter Keating-like way of copying everybody else. So obviously, in the very early years, you don't choose your values. They're automatic. You're moved by a pleasure-pain mechanism. The baby, the young child, acts under the stimuli of pleasure and pain, has automatic urges and aversions. But this is the pre-ethical level. I remember I said at the outset that egoism comes at the stage of consciously choosing abstract principles of action. That implies that you're at the stage of consciously choosing values, not merely reacting as everybody else does. Otherwise, if you couldn't grasp that your values come from your choice, you could never reach such a high abstraction as the beneficiary of this complex concept of well-being is going to be consciously chosen by myself. You have to build conscious choice at the beginning. It's got to be, in effect, your progression has to be, I choose, therefore I act, therefore I seek all these things which have such and such a common denominator, which is well-being, and now, should I get it for myself or for somebody else? That's the structure. Now, how do you grasp I choose? The very best way to get I choose is when you clash with others. Now, I'm not saying that if you have rational parents in a rational environment, it's impossible to grasp the concept of I choose. But what you have to be able to do at this early stage is grasp, I choose as against, I simply obey. I simply accept. I simply follow my parents, the church, convention, etc. I decide what's good. So implicitly, even if you don't have the concept independence, you have to have the idea of I did it, I picked it, I selected it. Otherwise, you don't have the concept of valuing, and therefore you really don't have the concept ever of value. The most you could get without this stage is I pursue goals. But that would not be enough to give you any clue to the answer of the questions of ethics. And as I say, the best way to get it is by say everybody else doesn't want this, but I do. So there's a self-assertion involved in valuing, in choosing, that has to strike you. Otherwise, I think you can see you're never going to get to egoism, and most people never dream of it because they don't choose their values, and consequently, even if they hold, quote, values, having missed this initial stage, there's nothing there to lead them to egoism. This is indispensable to getting to egoism because it's indispensable to getting to values. And egoism is a question of who should be the beneficiary of values. You first have to have the idea of value, and that means the idea of valuing, and that means choosing. You see, there's a terrific example of reduction, way down a complicated choice, all the way back to an internal, directly observable, I choose this. I found this reduction very easy because all I had to do is project Ayn Rand's development, and I happen to know her well enough to know that way before she had any concept of self-interest, and way before she had any clear idea what course of action was required to gain a given end, she knew in every realm what she chose. I choose this as my favorite, this toy, this color, this, etc. She always was clear. This is what I choose as against what they choose. And then later came the question, all the higher questions. Well, how do you get all these things? That which one acts to gain and keep, and what is common to them all, and then why should I be the beneficiary? But the root of it all is this. So using adult terms, I would summarize the reduction as follows, and these are the terms that she used as an adult, but they capture these three elements, if you remember the three that I said. I'm not saying it necessarily in the same order that I gave it, but these are the three. Value implies valuer. That's the I choose. Value implies a standard of value. That was the first one coming down. And value implies an action that achieves it. Or in technical philosophic terms, value implies virtue. Virtue is the action which achieves a value. Value involves three things. And you have to go through each of those to get to the concept of who should be the beneficiary of value. Or we can put the three things another way. You say this is of value, and then there's three questions. To whom? That's the chooser. For what? That's the standard. And how, or by what means? That's the action. All three elements are essential in some form to having a real concept of value. Now, the best I can work it out, and this is not, set in stone, but the best I can work it out, the to whom comes first. And the common denominator has to come last, so that leaves the action as in the middle. That's the best I can work out the order of the three stages. Now, pause here. This is not induction, but this is the forecast of what the argument is going to be. Egoism involves a fourth issue. Who is to be the beneficiary? Not who chose it. or by what standard, or how it's achieved, but who benefits from it. Now, since that's not self-evident, the only way we're ever going to validate egoism as the beneficiary is going to be to show that that is inherent in the other three. That it's like a corollary of the first three. That once you get the right answers on the first three, to whom, by what standard, and by what means, looking at the same thing from another point of view, it'll be you're the beneficiary. As a matter of fact, we can look at history here and see that every code of ethics, once these earlier questions are set, the beneficiary is automatically dictated. The beneficiary issue is not a primary issue. It's a dependent on these others, and we just saw the reduction which demonstrates that it's a dependent. But just look at religion and socialism as two arch examples. Religion tells you the chooser of values, the one who proclaims what's good and not, is God. It tells you that the achiever of values is God. You know, God giveth, and man just as passively receives what God creates. It tells you that the standard of value is love of God, adherence to God, fulfilling God's demands. And then, obviously, who is to benefit? Well, it's hard to say God is to benefit because he's already perfect, but his plan is to be carried out. And imagine this situation, that the first three all went to God, and at this point you came in and said, no, values are for my sake and benefit. That would be an impossible contradiction, because he would say God chooses them, God achieves them, God's well-being defines them, and you're coming in and saying it's all for me. On what possible grounds? You are completely a zombie in this whole setup. So how you could suddenly, on top of that, it would be grossly unfair. And that's the principle, God giveth and God taketh away. If you created it, okay, that's one thing to say you have a claim to it, but he creates it in every sense. He defines it, he produces it, it's all oriented around him, and now suddenly you're there and say it's mine, you would be laughed out of court. The same thing is true in regard to socialism or collectivism. Who creates value? Your group, whether it's mankind or the proletariat or whatever. Who achieves value? Obviously the group. There's a big stress on the individual, achieves nothing. He just steals from the atmosphere. What's the standard of value? Love of the group, adherence to the group, fulfilling the needs of the group. And who is to be the beneficiary? Obviously, the public good. And again, in that situation, it would be fantastic to say, yes, society defines values, achieves values, and is the standard of value, but the beneficiary is to be me. Now, exactly the same thing applies. You see that the beneficiary follows inevitably from the others. The same thing applies with regard to egoism. The argument that we're going to forecast is going to be, if I choose and create values by my choice, if I'm the one who achieves them, and if in some way the standard of value pertains to me, then I am obviously going to be the one who benefits from it. If values are my choice and my achievement and are defined in relation to my needs, then who else could be the beneficiary in reason but me? Imagine the beyond injustice, the irrationality of saying, you choose values, you achieve them, and Catherine gets them. I'm pointing to somebody else. I mean, it would be bizarre. It would be just out of the blue. So that's the plot that we are basically going to go through. All right, now let's turn to these three inductions, and if not perform them, since we don't actually perform whole inductions here, at least indicate and thereby build up to the concept of egoism. Now, the best person to observe in establishing egoism is yourself, because it's your motivation and your choices that you're trying to validate as the supreme end. So it is possible and appropriate to observe others, but it would be ridiculous to be selfless in your validation and say, well, I'm ignoring myself now, I'm just concerned with other people. So let's start with grasping the idea of the valuer. Your first induction would have to be the discovery that all of the things that you pursue and treasure are things that you chose, as against merely accepted. Now here, Ayn Rand is the perfect example of an incipient egoist. She had a favorite in every category which she chose. She had a favorite toy, and she was utterly indifferent to the toys that wasn't the one she chose. She had favorite music, and she would go anywhere to hear that music, and she didn't care about the rest of the stuff. She had a favorite color, and then when she grew older, she had a definite type of person that she chose, and if it wasn't that type of person, she wasn't interested. There were definite books that she wanted to read, and she hated the stuff that was foisted on her. And then within the books, she had definite character that she chose. If you know, for instance, the story of Cyrus, the subjects at school, the foods, she had a definite opinion of what type of party she liked and what type of party. And we're talking about very young here, before she even has a clue as to how to throw a party or write a book or anything of that kind. This is the first stage of being a valuer and thereby ultimately becoming an egoist. And now I think if you had stopped her in mid-stage at that point of her development and said, she wouldn't know the word egoism, but if you said, what is the substance of egoism in your mind? The best answer you could have elicited from her at that stage would be, I decide what is of value. Now, it sounds like subjectivism. And if you stay at that stage forever, you end up like Nietzsche, where you're frozen in this first stage and you never grasp the role of reality. And the result is, and you know, if you know Ayn Rand, there was a little subjectivism in her very early journals before she worked her way out of it. And I see ever more clearly why that would have to be the case, because if the starting point has to be within, I chose this. And that's why she always made such a sharp distinction between values and facts, even though in another way she would say values are dictated by reality. It was always, but value is something I choose, not merely something I selflessly acknowledge. Now then, the second stage, which is a simple growth from the first stage. All my values require action by me of some kind. That's an induction. And that's what leads to a value, is that which one acts to gain and keep. Now, she couldn't get this at the beginning. For instance, she loved blue-green, but she couldn't see any action. But then later, she would come to see it, and she grows older. You know, you can choose blue-green clothing, and you can ask for blue-green wallpaper, and etc. and so on. And friends and books and all the rest of it. Each one involved a type of action, and that was built into her psychology, so that if she hated life in Russia, she didn't just curse it the way her sister did. She didn't just say, oh, woe is me. She moved heaven and earth to get to the United States. And if she wanted a career as a writer, she didn't sit there in Chicago and say, oh, God, I'm stuck here in this terrible job. She just took off for Hollywood and bumped into Cecil B. DeMille. And if she found this man on the streetcar desirable, she didn't say, oh, isn't it a shame, you know, I have no computer match. What am I going to do? I'm so lonely. She followed him off the streetcar and tripped him on the movie lot. Now, those are the things in her life from which she then simply induced whatever I value requires action by me to gain. And that's what led to the idea of value is that which one acts to gain and keep. So she was very aware at this point that any time she got a value, she had to do something to get it. She had to achieve that value. Now at this point, of course leaving aside automatic values, which is outside the realm of ethics, at this point, if you could elicit from her what is egoism, she could have given you a fuller definition. I am the chooser and the achiever of all of my values. All right, now we go to the third stage. This is the essential underpinning. We now have a clear, real concept of value, but we have to give it a content. So we have to have a whole series of values and try to find some kind of common denominator that makes them values, which will be the standard then giving us an idea of your own welfare, your own interest. Now, I'm going back now to the point that how do you get this? We observe all the things that we want and all the things that other people. Can you just take anything that you value, anything you want? Obviously, there has to be limits. Even Ayn Rand, out of context, could pursue something that's no good. But the question is, how can there be limits when we don't have any ethical theory yet? And now I'm going to say something that some of you will get, and some of you will be very upset at, judging by the last time I gave this course. You cannot just at this point observe yourself or anybody pursuing anything he wants, or anything that makes him feel good, or anything that he says is his good. You can't ignore the question, is it irrational, crazy, self-destructive? Obviously, now think of it this way. We're trying to come to the conclusion that egoism is good. How could we do that? By starting with actions at random, whether good, bad, right, wrong, virtuous, or monstrous, and use them as data to deduce that egoism is good. You can't reach the good as a summary of good and bad. So we have to have a rule right here, principle governing any positive normative induction. Whenever we are inducing a positive principle by observing human action, you cannot simply observe behavior unevaluated. Now you can do that as far as grasping that you have to choose and that you have to act, but that is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Just because you chose and acted does not mean that what you chose and acted to gain is right. We have to observe and induce, but we're restricted to what we admit for our basic observations because our goal is to conclude what ought to be. So we can use at the outset only actions that we judge to be good. Now you're saying, well, aren't I begging the question? Am I assuming objectivism? Am I assuming egoism? No, but I am assuming something. Not egoism and not objectivism. But I am assuming that by the time we reach an ethical induction, we already know many virtues and values and many vices and disvalues. Not egoism. We're leaving that out here. We don't know that yet. We're trying to validate that. But that we know already many virtues, vices, values, and disvalues. You cannot approach ethics unless you already know in some terms that there is a big difference between virtuous and vicious actions, between good and bad things, between the proper and the improper, however we put it. You cannot induce moral principles in a moral vacuum. We haven't yet worked out a theory of what's common to good acts or good things, or how we defend that they're good, or even by what standard they're good. That's what we're trying to take the first steps to learn. But even to induce the idea that egoism is right, we have already reached the idea some things are right and others aren't. So we have to know in some terms the difference between food and poison. between going to the dentist to have a cavity drilled and going to a vampire to have your neck drilled, between travel as a reward for work and travel as an escape from the police. Now, all of this is well known to 12-year-olds. We have to begin and form our principles on the basis of what we know or believe is proper behavior. Now, this leaves us with the obligation later in our development and to spiral back and validate these starting beliefs, which we're taking for granted at the outset. And if later in our development we reach a point of realizing that there were some mistakes, then come back, throw them out, and see what changes that requires. But none of that changes the fact that if you don't make moral distinctions from the beginning of this induction, then you're in the impossible position of trying to induce a moral principle from instances, some of which are corrupt. So at this stage, we take what we can call common sense objects and actions that we hold to be good, strictly on the grounds of common sense, without a philosophic justification, and try and reach some kind of common denominator. Now, before we go any further, let me elaborate on that, because this caused a lot of trouble the last time, and there is some confusions in people's mind here. Do I mean that you can take as your starting point any arbitrary thing you want and call it common sense? Obviously, no. By common sense here, I do not mean any arbitrary thing you want. Each of the things that I'm taking as a common sense starting point, even at the beginning, has a fragmentary, partial, early validation. All of these values that I'm going to read to you were known to civilizations throughout history, way before and apart from objectivism and apart from philosophy. They're known to children who are not brought up as objectivists. There is an ample preliminary, partial, fragmentary knowledge of good and evil, ample for beginning thinkers. And that has to be where we start. Now, for example, this is what I would take as a typical list of common sense values that we simply start with as values. Food as against starvation. Clothing. Strength as against weakness. Health rather than sickness. Being awake rather than being in a coma and falling off a bridge or into the jaws of a bear. Money. Friends. Knowledge. Some kind of praise or recognition as opposed to being denounced by everybody for what you do. Some kind of entertainment or amusement as opposed to being bored. And even in a great many civilizations, some kind of respect for other people and their things on the simple golden rule argument. I wouldn't want it done to me, so I don't want to do it to them. Now, you could not say, well, if you don't have objectivism, it's arbitrary to value these things. That is ridiculous. You do not need objectivism to value food or health or even friends, which is an abstract value. Now, to give a definitive, final validation of any one of these, you have to go back to life as the standard. But you can't get to life as the standard except through a whole bunch of preliminary values. And you can validate in a preliminary way every one of these on a common sense basis which is not arbitrary, but not yet the total philosophically. So if your idea is all or nothing, either I have the Ayn Rand definitive validation or it's arbitrary, that is Hegel. That your choice is either omniscience or ignorance, and that leaves open the question, how did you get to omniscience? Except through stages of knowledge. Even a young child with a remote degree of intelligence can say, for instance, about even something as abstract as friendship. Well, if I say, why do you want a friend? Can say, well, someone to talk about things to, someone like me. It's hard to think with people that are so different from me. It's easier to talk to this person. When I'm tired, it's more fun to be with this person, to play games, etc. It's not like I have a subjective arbitrary revelation. They can give perfectly convincing reasons in their context. Now, can they say what Ayn Rand or Aristotle would say about the philosophic value of friendship and how that's inherent in holding values and in life as the standard? No, certainly they can't, but that does not mean it's arbitrary to value friendship. If you take the view that without knowing life as the standard, these are arbitrary, you are basically saying that without objectivism, a person who values friendship and a murderer are equal, or else they're equally unknowable or morally undistinguishable. And that is simply fantastic dogmatism. Now, someone is going to say, well, you're putting the whole thing on these common sense values. What if you make a mistake? What if you live in a corrupt age? What if you toss in as a common sense value, say, some community service? Or mercy to criminals, take that as an example. Wouldn't you then, suppose we took mercy, and, you know, we just don't think, and that seems to be a kind thing to do, and we confuse mercy and kindness, and we put mercy in our list as the starting point, the common sense starting point. You might then ask me, don't you then build error or falsehood into all of your subsequent ethics? And the answer is no, you don't. Because as long as you keep going, that is to say, inducing honestly, you will in time expose and discover your own contradictions. And here you're saved by the fact that life requires a consistent course of action, and any other course will harm it. Therefore, you can't be wholly consistent with a false value, or you're going to die. And the more you develop, the more you're going to see it clashing at every point. All of your other values with this alleged common sense value, and you're going to be forced, ultimately, if you're honest and logical, to say, I must have made a mistake. Now, let's just take this example of mercy in pattern. You think food, health, money, friends, and mercy are 5 common sense values. So when this vicious criminal commits his crime, you let him go, you don't punish him for it. Now right away there's a conflict. This guy is a potential poisoner and food is of value. This guy is a potential maimer or aggressor, but health is of value. This guy is a potential robber, but money is of value. Even in terms of friendship, he's got friends that are just like him, who are agitating to let him off, and they're all potential threats, and you're now in league with them. Isn't there something wrong here? So however you look at it, wherever you look at, the conflict, time and again will come up. You say, something is wrong here. And then you'll go back and question it. So it's not the case. If you go by induction, a mistake is not fatal, because you have to continuously integrate as you go. That's the purpose of integrating, or one of the purposes. And if you have a mistake, it can't be integrated. And that's precisely the sign that you better come back and question what you took for granted. So it's perfectly safe to take the best set of values you can do at the beginning, which is not arbitrary, but on a very fragmentary, context. And you will find that in all rational sciences, including philosophy, errors are self-correcting across time. Now, if you do keep induction going till you reach the fundamental principles of philosophy, ultimately you'll be able to integrate all your starting points to the basic principles and standards, and thereby you will definitively validate all of your ideas, including the common sense beginnings. And that, in fact, is what I did in OPAR. That's exactly what I did. I took every value and virtue that an inductive process would start with and gave a whole chapter or section to every one of any complexity. I took the starting points, what's today is our starting points, like friendship or art or whatever, and turned around and said, why, given life as the standard, this is a value and this is a value, but this is not. Like, what was it, harmony or spontaneity or whatever. But the point is that you can't reach the ultimate, and nor could Ayn Rand, without starting points to get there. That's what it means to get there by induction. So there's no use saying, I want a total validation, or else it's nothing. I won't accept it. It's arbitrary. That is rationalism. That is rewriting reality. That is stamping your foot at the fact of reality. And if you do that, and there are objectivists that have that attitude, which they think, because I don't want to accept anything that doesn't have, quote, full proof, what it amounts to is, I am a principled ignoramus until I read Ayn Rand. And then, out of the blue, knowing nothing, somehow, it all enters my mind. I get axioms and an inner development that's unanswerable, with a few juicy examples to delude myself that it's not rationalism. Now, if you try it, the only thing you're ever going to get from that is more rationalism. You'll never understand it. So you have to make your peace with the fact that you start off with partial understanding, possibly infected with error. But you will, if you know the method, you will end up with full understanding, purged of error. Now, either you can live with that or you can't. Now, it's very bad if you're polemical in your basic motivation, because what if you're arguing with somebody and it turns out you were wrong? Then you're really, in a bad way. But you just have to decide whether you're engaged in this for cognition or you're engaged in this to beat down your professor. Now, with that, I hope I have stilled some of the protest from rationalists. And that brings us then to the question, what would be a list of common sense values? Once we know what a value is, sufficient to define well-being. And then what can we do to unify that list to get the idea of well-being, or some idea of a standard? Now here's the list I gave you the list. And I ask you right now, what is common? That's what you have to induce at this stage. And remember, it doesn't have to be life as the standard, because we don't know that yet. It may not be any one thing, but it's got to be some kind of common denominator. And the whole history of philosophy gives you a clue as to what it is. Now, I'm going to go through the list and tell you in each case how I, as a beginning inducer, what I would see. Now, the list is obvious things. There's no surprises here, because we're taking obvious things as our starting point. Food, shelter, clothing, money, work or a job, friends, knowledge or education, entertainment, travel, art. That's all I listed. That's sufficient if you could put it all together to get some concept of self-interest. Now, what is common to all of these if I'm just at the beginning? Well, I know right away I could say two things about food. I'm going to starve without it, and it's a lot of pleasure. And I could see those combination under shelter and clothing. I could see that they're practical necessities. I won't live without them. And in addition, I get a lot of enjoyment if it's beyond just a house that, keeps me sheltered, and clothing if it comes from Armani and not just from Kmart. So there's an element of pleasure, luxury, enjoyment over and above. Now let's look at money. Obviously, I need to pay my bills, which is a practical necessity, without which I'm not going to have the food and shelter, etc. And at the same time, there's a lot of things you can do with money. Beyond what seems to be obvious necessities, you need it for entertainment, travel, art, education, etc. So it ties into the other values. It's obviously something that is a lot of fun to have. Now, a work or a job, right away, I have to earn money. I have to produce. And now if I tie that into what I learned last week in our induction, that production is what reason enables us to do, and that's our means of survival. And now I can tie work in, helps to keep me alive through production, and money then contributes to that. And if I like my work, it gives me a sense of fulfillment, enhanced enjoyment. Now, friends or loved one is a harder one to work in here, because even though sometimes they're a practical help, they're not always. Let's say I'm at the stage where I have no clue why love or sex, for instance, has any practical function. I don't want kids, so I can't tie it into survival. All I know is if I have somebody to share things with, it banishes loneliness and makes everything else much more enjoyable. If I don't, it's like the food stops mattering and the job isn't as satisfying, etc. So I just say this is some kind of enhancement of the others. I don't know what. Knowledge obviously is practical. Entertainment, I don't know. All I can say about that is sometimes I'm tired. I need to rest, without which I can't do the other things. So in some way this contributes to it all, but I'm not clear how much or let's say in what way. Travel, again, I don't know. I couldn't even be sure that is a value, except it would come under entertainment in some way. Art, I haven't a clue. I know that art has some deep effect upon me. It makes me think when I read it. It gives me some sense of myself and what I want. It's some kind of meaningful direction, but I don't know. It somehow enhances what I'm doing in the rest of my life, but I don't know. That's basically the most I could say at this stage. As an intelligent beginning inducer, I could get that out of Kira, say. And then we just have to induce. What is a common denominator? It has to be loosely worded, but in some way unite these and give us an idea of self-interest.
Your daughter. They don't know.
I think the best common denominator that I could list would be something like this. Well, the way the Greeks put it was a full, rich, happy life. That's what the Greeks said. Or a successful, fulfilled life. Or life and happiness. Or life plus the enjoyment of life. Something of this kind. Now, you see, that is not nearly as rigorous as life as the standard. We're still leaving open a lot of questions. What's the relation between your happiness or your enjoyment and what's required for life? Is it a whole bunch of arbitrary additions that you can say, or what? We haven't dealt with that question at this stage. We're beneath that question. We're before that question. All we know is there seem to be things at this stage that aren't necessary to keep you alive, but that add to the pleasure of being alive. So our formula is going to be, it comes as the good if it promotes life or the enjoyment of life. That's the best we can do at this stage. The one thing I want to say is it's not enough at this stage to simply say happiness, because then you'll develop as a hedonist. If you say happiness, it's purely subjective. Then there's no criterion at all and anything goes. Anything that anybody says makes him happy. But if we make it happiness as the enhancement of life, as whatever enables you to enjoy food, work, shelter, clothing, etc., then we don't have to be philosophers yet, but we've closed the door on just a complete subjectivism. Good is whatever you feel is good. You see, which if we get that, we can't get anywhere. We can't go anywhere. So we've reached a point here where we're not like a child with just a bunch of concretes, nor are we like a philosopher. I mean, this formula is very generalized. It leaves open a lot of questions, but it gives us something to start with, a common sense, which is what better people throughout the world have used. Now, if you stay there forever, that'll disintegrate, just the way the Greeks disintegrated, because you don't have a definition. But you can have a definition of everything. You got to start. So to me, that is a nice starting point. So now, we've spent 1 hour and 10 minutes, 6 of it, and we've reached this stage. I choose and I achieve objects according to the standard of. They foster life for the enjoyment of life. Well-being means that which fosters life for the enjoyment of life. So there are things I choose and achieve which foster life for the enjoyment of life. And now we have one question. The dictionary definition is, let me see if I can dig that up, that we started with. Each person should hold his own well-being as the supreme end of his actions. So that would translate to, each person should hold his own life or the enjoyment of it, which he himself has to choose and achieve as the supreme end of his actions. Now, is that legitimate? Put another way, we have only the beneficiary question. Who is to get the benefit of this process? Whose life or enjoyment should be the concern of the person acting? Should the person who chooses and achieves and does so by the standard of promoting life and the enjoyment of life be the one whose life is involved in his actions, whose life is the supreme end of his actions? Or should the person who chooses and achieves and promotes life and the enjoyment of life say, not my life, but somebody else's life? That's what the question of egoism comes to. Well, let's say, what is the alternative now? Here's where we need a contrast. We're trying to validate egoism. What are we contrasting it to? And that'll bring us to the genus method. We want to see this now under a broad principle. Obviously, I don't think we're going to finish egoism tonight, but that's okay, because I didn't finish it in one time last time either, because I snuck in half of tonight's lecture in the form of a question period in lecture 4. So I never thought I would finish tonight, so don't panic. We definitely will get there. Who knows, I might even finish. What would the genus be here, of which egoism is our ultimate subdivision? Well, we're talking about the beneficiary of an action. Do only human actions have beneficiaries? Beneficiary. Who benefits? Who gains? No, obviously. It's broader than human beings. Is it just animals? No. Well, actually, any living thing benefits from what it does, right? So the broadest principle that I can think of that would be helpful here is all living entities act to gain values for a beneficiary. That's what I would see as the Binswanger genus. Now, whether he agrees with that formulation. Harry, I guess you're muted, but bang the table in New York if you disagree with that. Now, that would be in contrast to mechanical action, for which, you know, like a rock rolling down a hill, which aims at nothing for any beneficiary. Now, let's subdivide. A living entity acting for a beneficiary. Obviously, the first main subdivision is volitional and non-volitional living entities. The non-volitional are plants and animals, which act automatically for their own well-being and are therefore excluded from ethical classification. And the other wing is what we're interested in, and that is volitional. Now, let's stop and think. Do we right away say those who act for their own well-being as opposed to those who act for who are subordinated to something else? No, because this is one of the major values of the genus is you're going to sweep the whole territory, and if we divided volitional into those who are egoists and those who are altruists, or those who are egoists and those who are self-sacrificers, what would we omit? The vast, vast majority of mankind who are neither. What are they? They're eclectic, they're mixed, they're unprincipled. They have no idea whether they live for their own sake or anybody else's. So we have to, under the volitional, in order to capture the empirical data, and this is the great value of the genus method, subdivide it into men who act consciously on principle. That's men who choose a beneficiary now, consciously on principle, versus those whose actions in this regard, in regard to beneficiary, are random, eclectic, unconscious, inconsistent. Now notice we wouldn't think of this if we didn't go through the genus method, and right away this tells us that the ordinary person is not an egoist. That doesn't make him an altruist either. He comes under the category of eclectic, unconscious, unprincipled. So if you're talking about the type of person who goes to work and likes the money, but he gives to charity periodically as he feels that it's his duty, and he sacrifices for his mother-in-law periodically, and the part of the time he resents his mother-in-law, tells her to go to hell, and he insists that he wants to go to the movie he wants to see, but then on other days he says, oh, I don't care, marriages, sacrifices, whatever you say, sweetheart. This type of person is not an egoist. He's not an altruist. He's not anything philosophically. Now you might say he's self-destructive in the larger sense of being unprincipled, but in terms of the categories we're using today, he's out. That's not what we're trying to validate, nor is that the opposite of what we're trying to validate, only except to the extent that it's unprincipled and we're trying to validate something principled. And that's going to be important when we contrast egoism to altruism. It's going to be a principled altruist, which is the only thing that we can contrast a principled egoist to. And that's going to make a huge difference in our validation. So now, within those whose choices are consciously principled, we can now divide it into those whose principle is to aim at yourself as the ultimate beneficiary, versus those whose principle is to aim at something other than yourself as the ultimate beneficiary. Now, as I see it, there are three versions of acting for something other than yourself, or of subordinating yourself to something above yourself. God, which gives you the religionist version. I live for God, like St. Augustine. Other people, that's the altruist version. I live for society, or other people. Or, that's the socialist or collectivist or altruist version. Or nature. I subordinate and sacrifice myself for inanimate nature, and that's the ecologist, ecological version. There are just three different versions of who should be the beneficiary: God, people, or rivers. The climate, the ozone layer, whatever the hell they pick. Now that happens to be a particularly bizarre variant, but you know, it's doing well today because altruism paved the way. God paved the way for altruism by inculcating self-sacrifice, and altruism engendered such hatred of man for man that they want to wipe out the whole species now, but they're still looking for something to sacrifice to, but it can't be the human species anymore, so they found something inanimate. So it's a kind of a logical, if ghoulish, progression. But now, given that, we are now ready, thanks to the genus method, to know what are we going to induce from. We have to have direct observation of men acting to gain a value for themselves as the ultimate beneficiary versus men who methodically pursue something other than their own welfare, and leaving aside altogether the random, unthinking types. Now, you may say to me, you left out Kantians. That is, people who aim methodically at no beneficiary of any kind. And I say I left that out because there's no instance of it. You can be religious and you can be an altruist, however inconsistently, but you can't be a Kantian at all. You would just lie in bed if you completely wiped out the idea of interest. So, or a beneficiary. So, we're looking at reality now, not philosophers. Now, so what we want is to observe egoism in action, contrasting with principled altruism. We can either do several issues of egoism and then go back and look at the altruist contrast, or do the contrast as you go. I think for simplicity I'm going to do the egoist first, but with a note to myself, when I'm finished I've got to go over those same ones and contrast what the altruist one would be. I got to get a flood of instances and see what happens on the egoist version versus the altruist version. And that'll help me to get clear what is egoism and what happens if you reject it. Now remember, we have to check how many things in each case of egoism to live up to what we said. We have to check that the person involved chose the value, that he acts to achieve the value, he creates it, he does or pays something to get it, and it redounds to life or the enjoyment of life. And since he's an egoist, it's got to redound to his life or his enjoyment of life. So that's the three things we're going to look for. As soon as you see a Peter Keating type who makes no choice, he's out. As soon as we see somebody passive saying, give it to me, that's out as an observation. And as soon as we see somebody destroying life or enjoyment, like a masochist, that's out. Now you see why I don't want to bring in altruism at the same time, because I got three things already to check on each instance for to grasp egoism properly. So, I think the best thing is to start here by, if you are an egoist, with your own inner motivation, with your own self as your object, because egoism is essentially an issue of your motivation. Whose welfare are you after? What beneficiary are you aiming at? So it's obviously best to start with your own motivation, assuming you're an egoist. If you're not, then you have to try to find them in the case of others. And the best thing then, if you are mixed up totally, is just go through some of Ayn Rand's characters, because they're consistently egoistic in their motivation. Now remember, we want a flood of instances. So egoism conveys a million things to it. Now all you have to do is take all the different values that we already mentioned and show in each, see instances in each case where the person involved chooses, achieves, and it redounds to their life or well-being. And it's really very obvious here. It's just an issue of doing it methodically. So there's almost nothing left here to observe. We're just summarizing now by doing the overall observation. I always start with food, shelter, and clothing to avoid subjectivism, something physical and real. Now, I definitely chose these things. It's not simply because society or God or whatever. I can say what actions I take to acquire them specifically, and then indirectly, in the sense that if I don't grow the food, I have to earn the money and make the trade. But if any of that is unclear to you, if you think somehow clothing comes from mankind and you didn't have to do something to achieve it, this is the point where you have to clarify. So you see that the value that you chose is the value you're achieving. And you have to see, and it's very obvious on these cases, that without food, shelter, and clothing, your life, your health, your strength, your comfort would be tremendously sabotaged, so that you would be miserable and your life would be threatened. Now, am I my own number one concern in the pursuit of these values? And here there's no answer but your direct introspection. If you ask me, I say absolutely. I do not pursue these with anyone else in mind, neither God, nature, or other people. If, for instance, it's not true that I eat because otherwise I disappoint the class next Thursday. Now, at this point, I can either go into how an altruist eats or leave that, but I said I'm going to leave that. Now, what you basically have to do is do that same simplified pattern on everything that comes in the list of common sense values, showing in each case the various things that we mentioned. And it's pretty obvious, if your motivation is egoistic, that it is so. And if it advances your life, that it does so. Now, you might get stopped occasionally with things like, what about money? I give the money to the maid. So isn't that a case where I'm working to get money for somebody else? Now, if you're on that primitive level, then you'd have to say to yourself, but is that the ultimate? Remember, it's the supreme. No, it's because the maid is working, etc. So you'd have to clarify that. And then when you get to loved ones, you would have to discover, and this would take a separate act of thought, in what way love is selfish. And you'd have to go through it on all of these counts. In what way you choose the values that make you love or select somebody as a friend. In what way you earn the relationship. And that is not so easy. In what way you act to achieve it. Now, on an obvious common sense level, you do nice things for the person and so on. But on a deeper level, you have to know what you want, which involves a lot of introspection. You have to study the other person, which involves a lot of knowledge. You have to make then continuous judgments. Is this what I want or is this not? And what kind of relationship do I want? And how will I pursue it? And when do I draw the line? And etc. There's a tremendous amount of thought and action involved in building up or achieving a friend or a love type of relationship. You have to realize, therefore, the choice of the values that are involved, and then the actions, and then identify in what way the loved one is crucial to your happiness, and that therefore what you do for them is something you are doing to foster what we were calling life, or the enhancement of life. Now, this most people don't know. They actually don't grasp this at all. If you do something for somebody, let alone you love somebody, that's altruism. But that is bizarre. An egoist is not somebody who does nothing for others, just as an altruist is not somebody who never does anything for himself. Now, John Stuart Mill was the world's champion altruist, but he fed himself and he clothed himself. He did all kinds of things for himself, but he explained that when he did it, it was to keep up his strength so he could go on serving others. He's, by the way, the idol of the conservatives today. The issue is the ultimate beneficiary, not the direct beneficiary. Now, you've got to clarify it in your mind before you can induce. And that's what the purpose of going through the flood of examples is. You have to know what egoism means in 1,000 cases. It is not enough to say, I get it for myself, because in real life it's complex to identify. Now, I want to clarify one possible confusion here. Suppose you read in the paper about the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, and you say, you know, I was going to spend my summer visiting my boyfriend at our vacation home that we were going to rent. I don't know anything about the Albanians, but I'm going to work all summer, give up my vacation, not rent this home, and donate the money to the Albanians. Now, you don't associate with them. You have no knowledge of them. For everything you can tell, they're very different, if not opposite from you. But you say they need it, and I get satisfaction out of helping them. So now the question is that egoism? Well, we have to say, you get satisfaction. Is anything that gives you satisfaction egoism as we've defined it? Well, let's see. Why does the person get satisfaction? Well, they get satisfaction because they have done something good. And what is it that's good? By their statement, I gave up my vacation home in order to help somebody. I placed others above myself. Now you got to take the person at his word here. The real beneficiary, not just the direct, but the ultimate beneficiary is the Albanians. This person gets satisfaction precisely because, in his opinion, he ignored his own interests and he did something for others as against for himself. By his own statement, his satisfaction came from being unselfish. He felt good about it precisely because it wasn't selfish. And that gives you a very important point. If we put it as a principle like this, the fact that you feel good about your motivation does not change its nature or turn it into the opposite motivation. You see why? You have to have a flood of instances. You have to know what egoism is. And there's 1,000 seductive snares that will make you mixed up to know what it is, and then as a result, you have no idea what to think in your own mind when, you know, about these people who say, well, I get my pleasure out of serving in the Peace Corps or whatever. Now, if you are inducing and you find this kind of unselfish motivation in yourself, you got to stop and bracket that and say, this doesn't count. This is contradictory to the earlier case. I'm not putting myself as the supreme end here. Now, if you got a lot of values like this, then you're going to have a lot of trouble getting to the concept of egoism. And you certainly will never reach it on yourself. So I would suggest in that case, you better start over, using some other model. Now, what you basically have to do is go through the list of values and show in all these cases that no matter how they differ, you choose and achieve them, assuming you do, as a means to your own fulfillment as the supreme end. Now, I've done it here on all kinds of examples, but I just don't think it's necessary. Knowledge, in what way that is selfish to me, and in what way I had to choose a field of knowledge, and etc., etc., etc. And I could say a whole bunch, but I think the principle is clear. And a job, what it means to be selfish or to be egoistic in regard to a job. And the point is here, let me stress this, because it's a variant of what we just said. I knew a guy once who loved music and hated medicine, but capitulated to the demands of his family and went into medicine. And he said, when I argued with him that he shouldn't do it, but I want to do this. Don't you believe in selfishness? Now, the fact that you want to do it does not make it selfish. He wanted to be unselfish. And you say, well, he did it in order to have self-esteem. Yes, but his self-esteem came from placing others above himself as his primary concern. So, selfish doesn't mean I want to do it. It means I want to do it because I am the supreme consideration in my life. Exactly parallel, unselfish does not mean I don't want to do it. I didn't want to get up for work this morning, but that does not mean that I was unselfish when I did get up. It just meant I was lazy. Now you have to go through your choice of entertainment and travel, and art, etc. And you have a flood of concretes in which you are pursuing some value. You are the valuer. You are the means. Your life and happiness is what is promoted. And you can observe the same thing on many other people. And we now reach, I'm afraid that's the point we're going to have to stop because we only have 1 minute more. We now reach what I would say is our best definition of egoism at this preliminary stage. The pursuit by your own creative effort of objects chosen by you as necessary to your own life or happiness. The pursuit by your own creative effort of objects chosen by you as necessary to your own life or happiness. I tried to get everything in there. Now this is what we have to validate. Do you see why it's hopeless to validate the initial dictionary definition? There's no reason in the world out of the blue, without knowing what values are or where they come from or anything, there's no reason in the world to validate that you should be the supreme end. But now we're talking about validating this idea. Is it right if you put the effort and the choice and it's your life and happiness that is involved? So, now is where we have to come to what the contrast is, and that's exactly at the moment I have to stop. So next week, exactly at this point, we're going to just indicate the contrast between that and altruism, wrap up the validation with a few last points, and then I've got some questions, and I'm definitely then going to make a start on the next topic, but it won't be right at the beginning next time. We'll finish off egoism, and the assignment for maybe, let's say, a half hour into it next time is the virtue of justice. How do you establish that justice is good or right or crucial? By induction. Now that should hold you for a week. And I'm sorry, there's no time for questions. But I think I've given you enough to warrant being egoistic, at least hypothetically, until next week. So I'll say good night. Speak to you next week.